Is it also a challenge for a large organization? The grass is not as green as
Yeah.
it seems, right?
Going from idea to campaign might take you 2 years instead of 3 months or 6 months.
You have this department head is reaching out to you, asking you to do something, and you feel it's not your place to push back. How does that
Yeah.
work?
You know how many times just asking someone to fill out a form has stopped a project?
Do you see small organizations, let's say, rely more on email or internal, messaging, and large organizations use project management tools? Have you seen a difference in the scale?
They invest in tools, but then there's no owner, right? If they don't
Mm.
have an evangelist or an owner who can really be on it full time.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast from Symetris. I'm Brad, CEO and founder of Symetris, and we've been helping healthcare organizations for over 20 years, almost 22 years now, to help optimize their website, redesigns, etc. Today, I am joined by Alan Shoebridge, who is the Associate Vice President and Chief Communications Officer for National Communications at Providence. Providence is one of the largest health systems in the US, and he's leading communications across multiple states. And from brand to reputation, internal, external communications, all that is part of stuff that he's touched. And he's spent a lot of his career in different sizes of organizations, both large and smaller health systems. And that really gives him an interesting perspective on what that means for how these organizations operate and innovate. And what I really am looking for in Alan's conversation today is the fact that you're pragmatic, you're very grounded and kind of real stuff and real constraints. And you're not just like, getting the big ideas out there, but like what actually works. And so that's what I'm looking for today. So thanks for joining me, Alan.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brad. I'm excited about the conversation. And, I think this is a topic that a lot of people wonder about, some of the differences between large and small healthcare systems and what they can take from each. So I'm excited to talk with you about that.
All right, excellent. And I think it's something, and we had, talked about this a bit earlier, but it's not something that gets talked about that much. And sometimes I feel that a challenge is that there's going to be some kind of an idea or a presentation that someone has seen at a conference, and like, oh, wow, I want to bring that back to my organization and do that. And sometimes there's a disconnect between the capacity or the size of the organization, or like, are we putting some things in the wrong order, like the crawl, walk, run in certain contexts. So this is something that I think is really relevant because the size determines a bit what types of approaches and what constraints each person has.
Yeah. And I think, also like people often don't think, you can learn sometimes from others that are different than you. And I think, like small healthcare systems can learn from big and big can learn from small. It kind of goes both ways. So that's kind of the exciting thing is I think you really can learn, even if you're in a different position and you're working at a really well resourced organization, there's still things you can learn from the smaller organizations and vice versa. So I think it's kind of an exciting topic.
And so just kind of like a high level off the bat here, like what would you say, having seen both sides of the things, what are the differences from your perspective that stand out the most at a really high level? Like what's the obvious differences from a large or small?
I think one of the obvious differences is just sort of like the governance factor, right? So, when you're running a team in a huge organization, there's just a lot of layers of process and decision making and approval. And I think that's just, it makes sense, right? I mean, you're dealing with things that are just bigger. You've got more people involved, you've got more stakeholders to manage. And that just takes a level of kind of understanding how the organization works to really make sure you can move things through at a good pace. And I think that's one of the things people struggle with. Say, if you go from a small organization into a large organization, just figuring out all the stakeholders who you need to engage when you want to make a decision, what resources, what the processes are. Again, there's a lot of sort of layers that go on at a big organization. At a smaller organization, I think you can just a lot of times just kind of be quick. There may be, instead of having 4 or 5 layers, maybe have 2 layers. Maybe you get a budget, make every decision you want on your own, So though that kind of governance piece is the biggest thing that you have to adjust to, I think, especially when you're going from small into a big organization.
Right. But does that not come like if let's say I'm from a small organization and I'm looking at this large organization, like, oh my goodness, they have so much budget, they're doing so many campaigns at the same time. There's like some kind of a jealousy in a sense or envy on what they can accomplish, but it's probably not as green. The grass is not as green as it seems, right? So is the fact that there's this large scale, is it also a challenge for a large organization?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because I think you have a lot of priorities. You have a lot of almost like sometimes when you have so much, it's like, how do you prioritize, right? When I think when you're a smaller organization, maybe you're leading a smaller marketing or communications team, you're like ruthlessly prioritizing everything. And, you only have so much you can do. I think when you have, bigger teams, more resources, there is a lot you can do. And so really sometimes I don't know if you operate as lean and or as nimble as you could be. At an organization, when you're smaller, you just got to be scrappy. So, I mean, there is that piece to it. I think too, some people thrive in either setting, right? So I think, when you're looking at, and this might getting a little bit off topic, but in personal development, when you're thinking like where you want to go work, you want to go work for a large or small organization.
Right.
You just think of like those things that make a difference. Like how fast do you want to be able to make decisions? How many stakeholders do you want to manage? Do you get frustrated if things get slowing down? Are you a person who can work around barriers and figure out a way to move forward? Really think about assessing yourself, like what environment would I fit in well? And sometimes you don't know until you try it.
Right.
But I do think that piece is big, like understanding the culture. Again, like figuring out a large organization is going to take time. You get thrown into a small organization, 1,000 employees or less or whatever. I mean, you can figure out who's making decisions. You can figure out how to navigate things in a very short period of time versus, getting thrown in an organization that has 100,000 people or more. That's just going to take more time. So, if your comfort level is good with that and you're someone who kind of doesn't mind, you might get a no and you don't mind figuring out, okay, how can I go around that and find a way to get a yes? That could be a very good cultural fit. So there's sort of that like cultural component, I think. Again, people might look at the resources or the budget and say, wow, that's wonderful. I wish I had access to that. But they might get really frustrated about the fact that going from idea to campaign might take you 2 years instead of 3 months or 6 months.
Right, right. And it's okay. So, and I think that kind of sets the table a little bit to the different things we wanted to go over today. And I think the three main elements I want to maybe kind of single out and go into today are, the scale factor and the agility. So we were just talking about that in a sense. The governance that you brought up from the start, obviously, that's a huge difference from the smaller to larger organization. And the third one is that prioritization factor, where there's a difference in how you prioritize and the reasons why you need to do so. And so I'd probably start with the agility and scale. And when we're in a larger organization, I think one of the interesting advantages there is that there's a lot of people who can be more specialized. And so, because in a smaller team, in a smaller organization, everybody kind of has to do a bit of everything. But in a larger one, you can have someone who's really good with kind of the digital ads, and then someone else who's more like updating the website, someone else thinking about the overall strategy, whereas maybe there's not that luxury in a smaller organization, but at the same time, it allows for more maybe personal development.
Yeah.
You're saying that doesn't necessarily translate into speed, right? The fact that there's all these people there, but there's so many hoops to go through that might make things slower. So how do you balance those two things out?
Well, I think the key is just figuring out your comfort level with like decision making, how much you want to really engage like a lot of stakeholders versus again, small organization, you probably, you could be if you're running a marketing team, you'd probably know you have, maybe your boss and the CEO or whatever. That's your stakeholder group. And if you want to make a decision, that's who you're taking a recommendation to. And as long as you've got budget and there's no concern, you can probably just go forward and do what you want to do. But, again, a large organization, it's just more buy-in. I mean, you have to have a plan. You have to have different stakeholders. You probably have a lot of more things that are already sort of like always on type projects or marketing efforts, communication efforts, whatever it may be. And, there might be more things to put on hold or not do. So again, like I think, you can do very rewarding, impactful work in either environment. But I think in a smaller environment, again, you're just going to be able to control more decisions on your own and be like, I want to do something. I've got budget. I can go. Larger organization, you might have to have a business case. You might have to really prove something out. And not saying that small organizations don't sometimes have that same rigor. But again, I think you're much more likely to have to sell things to stakeholders. For instance, if you want to work with a different vendor, at Providence, and I think this is a really good thing, but at Providence, we have a pretty tight rule about bringing on new vendors, right? So we don't want to have hundreds of vendors and all this duplication if they're doing the same thing. So if I want to bring in a new vendor, a new partner, I got to have a really good business case that we don't already have someone that can do it. Again, there's going to be process reviews. It's probably going to take me 6 months to a year to onboard a new vendor.
Right.
Small organization, I could probably onboard a new vendor in 60 days if I wanted to, if I got the approval.
Right.
So again, there's reasons why there's a process at a larger organization to be good stewards and to have, to make sure that money's being spent wisely. But that can be frustrating to people because again, if you want to do everything right away when you want to do it, Not to say that can't ever happen in a big organization, it's more challenging. And I think there's good reasons why.
But the way you're kind of framing this is that, oh, you have all these hoops to go through, all these layers of approval, a lot of processes to, it kind of sounds like you're making it not as, like it's more entrepreneurial and almost like feels more fun in a small organization. But at the same time, there's a bunch of advantages of being in a large organization
Oh,
that come with those, those caveats of, yes, there's more business cases to build, right? And so what, from your perspective, are the advantages of being in
yeah.
a larger system
Yeah.
versus a smaller one?
Yeah, and just real quick too. I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily like any of those things in terms of process steps, or you talked about hoops or whatever. But I think they're most often they're valuable, right? And that is one. I guess that is one thing that I think is kind of a benefit being a large organization. You really have to think through what you're doing. Like, is this the right thing? Is it going to have an impact? Again, why do I want to do it? And yeah, I might have to make the case to a few more people, but that's kind of a good thing because they're really going to test whether that work is impactful. Does it deliver what we want to do? Is it aligned with our strategic plan? All that stuff is going to get tested out. I think you kind of referenced it a little bit, but there are tremendous amounts of benefit to being a large organization. The biggest one is you have a lot of expertise. You talked about it. So, at a small organization, you're going to be a jack of all trades. You're probably going to do a lot of things well, but you're maybe not going to be the foremost expert on whatever something is, right? And I think in a large organization, nice thing is you build a big team. You've got people who are very specialized who can really drill into specific tactics, or like for us on like for me in my current role on communications, we have people who they're just great with media, right? They're talking to reporters, they're doing that stuff. I don't have to do that because we have experts who can do it really well. So, having access to that team of really specific expertise, again, people who know tactics really well, like on the marketing side, again, that expertise is really valuable. And I think that is a really nice thing about the large organization is that you can tap into that team to do so much of the work. Whereas at a smaller organization, you're either going to try to do a bunch of stuff you don't know how to do real well, but you can kind of muddle through, or you're going to have to find partners all the time to help you. And again, that's not necessarily bad, but it's definitely a model. And I've always, I think, working at a big organization like Providence, being able to tap into a team, our communications team, we have over 100 people nationwide, being able to tap into people who really know how to do certain things well, it's a big benefit.
Right. And I think that's interesting because it flips a little bit the side of that, because there is this whole level of having to build the case, right? When you're starting something new, but when something is ongoing, right? And you have that expert in-house to do that change, then the speed is faster to, hey, let's change this campaign, let's A/B test this thing. Then you can do it much faster with internal staff. It's just that when it's these new projects or some initiative that doesn't have something proven yet, then at that point it gets a bit longer to add those new vendors. With the team that's there, you're more nimble and kind of trying out stuff than having to depend on a vendor or get a whole
Yeah.
slew of other things.
Yeah.
In the that approach of like working with vendors versus working internally, one thing that I've seen at other presentations regarding about this, it's adjacent to this, and I'd really be interested on your point of view about this is, you know, does a scale of organization by default create some kind of a maturity, right? Because
Mhm.
there has to be some maturity in the, let's say, digital maturity or marketing maturity of understanding the concepts or connecting the dots, connecting the data, et cetera. Is it by default that larger organizations have that maturity? Or is it really variable? Some smaller ones are more mature and some larger ones don't have that maturity level yet. Like
Yeah.
what do you feel about that?
That's a really good question. I think I'm kind of thinking back on my experience, and I feel like another benefit to sort of a large organization is you are having an opportunity to cycle more people through who are bringing different experiences. So, at a small organization, and thinking specifically like a marketing and communication team, I'm gonna have a couple people that've been there for like 15, 20 years or something to balance. Good people, like solid people, but they're not necessarily learning the same things that people who are coming in maybe from outside of industry, or maybe like, you're cycling in more talent and getting more outside perspectives at a larger organization. I think you're
Right.
bringing a wider view on the world, um, which does help a lot in thinking about your tactics. So, I think of like my time at Providence, we've been brought people in from other industries, outside that could really like kind of push our thinking. And again, we have people who have been here a long time and they're specifically in the healthcare space, but our ability to have a bigger, broader team where we bring in different people, we kind of cycle through, some positions a little quicker. Again, so many people might be here 5 or 10 years, bring new talent in, people from outside or whatever. And that's really hard to do at a small organization because either, Small organization too, and based on my experience, again, really good people, but sometimes it might be working in a market where there just isn't a lot of necessarily like outside talent that's always kind of coming through. When you're in a big organization, if you're a national organization, you've got access to a huge talent pool, and that does, I think, tend to up level the quality of your work quite a bit, or at least
Mhm.
to kind of like challenge your thinking about how work should be done.
So the quality, but also the innovation. So what you're saying is that since there's more people and there's, I'm not going to say more churn, but there's more variety in the type of people that come in and out of the organization. You're kind of cross pollinating a bit more than in a smaller organization. So that would be one of those advantages of being in the large one. Whereas, probably the caveat of that is that everybody has to always communicate, very aggressively to make sure everybody's aware of what the alignment is and where you're going, right? And I think that kind of feeds into the next item that we were talking about, or that we wanted to address, which is the governance, right? And, we were talking a bit earlier about how we have to get the buy-in of different stakeholders, and oftentimes, higher up or adjacently in other departments. And then there's this aspect internally of, there's 25, 40 people trying to work together, getting everyone aligned and working on the same direction at the same time becomes a completely different challenge than if you're, let's say, 5 to 10 people who are regularly interacting and everybody's pretty much aligned on what's going on. So have you seen those variances on both ends of the spectrum?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think one of the things is, again, I'll start with the bigger organization and we'll work back to smaller. But, when you have even initiated a new project, when you're working at a large organization that's maybe doing, gosh, thousands of projects a year, you have to put process in place to prioritize resources. That means, you probably need a request form. You probably need a review process. You have layers of process to get work done, because if you don't have that, then things kind of get chaotic. And how do you prioritize anything? So that naturally kind of builds some bureaucracy in. On this other side of the scale, some of a small organization is because you only have maybe a few people that are doing the work. You don't think about putting in those process steps, but that kind of creates its own side of chaos too, because then everything just comes in as a top priority. Right? You figure out
Right.
how to kind of rearrange. You don't have any process, and that's kind of that's difficult. So even in one of my roles, I was kind of going to a small organization. I did bring in some of that, not to the degree I would do it necessarily at a large organization, but some of that process thinking. How do you kind of empower your team, their small team, but to push back if people are asking for things they shouldn't, or prioritize, or review the work and the requests. So even doing things like, a stand-up meeting for a small team, right? And reviewing the requests that come in each week. That might seem to some people who have never used any process at all, wow, that seems like a lot of process. But you need something. You need something to govern your work. No matter if you're small or you're large, you need some type of process to really look at the intake. And I think about this a lot, when I'm doing more marketing-centric roles. You're just getting to ask for like creative and collateral and copy all the time,
Yeah.
right? And so if you don't have some process to intake that, you're going to it's really chaotic. But when you're in a small organization, especially if you've never worked anywhere else, you've never seen anything that really helps you build that process. So
Hmm.
I do think that sort of like governance stuff that just absolutely has to happen in a large organization can be used. It needs to be scaled back, but it can really be used in a small organization effectively. But you kind of need some experience. And you talked about it, how we learn from each other. I think that is the benefit of, if you work at a small organization, attending a presentation by someone in a large organization, learning what they do, because you might find some things that on the surface, you're like, we don't have anything in common, but you might find some things that really help you out.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's like the pick and choose, what works for your organization. But, to complete what you were saying about that governance aspect, I think that one challenge that I've seen so much is, let's say we're in the process of a redesign, and then, everybody has an opinion, and then you got the clinicians, and then you got the departments, and then it just kind of gets bogged down, right? And I think that there's, potentially we have that thought that in a large organization, there's even more people who have opinions. And I think,
Yeah.
yes, in a sense, but since the processes and the governance are more clear, then it's probably the level of distraction is probably not too far off from a smaller to a large organization because of those inbuilt systems and races, or like responsibility, accountability, etc., that are built into it. And maybe further into what you were saying, if we have to build the business case and think about all these things in advance, then probably that governance is going to be thought out maybe a bit more thoroughly in a large organization in advance than a small organization being maybe a bit more in reactive mode and having to set boundaries, maybe after the fact, and not have anticipated some items there.
It's funny. I just want to respond to one thing you said, which is the level of distraction, whether it's any different from large or small organization. I think it's sort of the same. It's dependent on you. I think is when you're running a team, or even maybe if just as an individual contributor. I just find most high performing people, they're just going to fill their day with work, right? I mean, they're just whatever it is, 40 hours, 50 hours, 60 hours, whatever they work. If they're a high performer, they're just going to want to do stuff. They're always going to want to do stuff. So whether you're a small organization or big, you'll find a way to fill your days,
Yeah,
and
right.
there'll be plenty of people asking you for stuff. But again, I think, it comes down again, like when you have those ideas, how fast can you put things into practice? Who are you managing as stakeholders? All that differ a little bit. But again, I think the high performers fill their time. They always will.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a really great segue, I think, into the kind of idea of prioritization, right? So the organization has a bunch of priorities. Larger ones have a bunch more, smaller ones have a bit fewer, but everybody's struggling with what should I prioritize? And that idea of, we have these kind of big rocks on our roadmap that we want to accomplish, but then we have all the sand going between the rocks and how to not get distracted by all that sand and not have any more place to put those rocks. So what has been, from your perspective, how you were saying that there's only two levels of decisions or getting to to the CEO, or allocating budget. And there's also a way of discussing that changes as well from a large organization because you have to
Yeah.
socialize it a bit more.
Yeah.
So how do you get to prioritizing and getting everyone aligned on those priorities?
Well, okay. So I feel like the framework for me, and I've learned this lesson painfully, either large or small, is you have to understand who your stakeholders are and who's going to decide whether what you're doing is ultimately a success or not. And do you know that? Because I have had in the past making a mistake of like, well, I'm going to do a body of work and I think it's Brad who's going to tell me whether this is a success or not.
Right.
But then I do the work and then I find out it's not just Brad, but it's five other people that I didn't even know about. And half of them don't really understand what we're doing or why, and they don't like it.
Yeah.
So I feel like, from a priority perspective, one of the first things to do is just assess like who does this matter to? I'm thinking a little bit more on like the intake side. So when you're getting asked to do work, who does this matter to? Who needs to see it? And who's going to ultimately decide if this is a success or not?
Hmm.
And mapping that out for each body of work is extremely important. And again, a small organization, hey, maybe it's two or three people. At a big organization, maybe it's 10. I don't know. Who knows, right? But and it could be a big organization. Maybe it's only two or three as well for a certain body of work. But again, I just think one of the key steps in prioritizing work is figuring out who all needs to be involved. How are they going to make their decisions? That's important. And the bigger the body of work is, the more important it is to, I think, nail that down. And then, I think either way, big team, small team, even just I see this happen all the time. People are not good about like specifying like when do you need something done? Do we have a budget to work with? Those kind
Now,
of like
yesterday. Yeah.
fundamental questions, right? Like this is fundamental questions that'll help you prioritize the work. I think that's really important. And then I talked about it earlier, but whether you're small or large organization, having some sort of process to prioritize, especially if you're in the position of intaking a lot of work. Things are really different on like the marketing and communication side. And I've had, space in both. And right now I'm on the communication side. And the work just doesn't come in the same way. Where in marketing things, I think a lot of times you just have people who they always need stuff. They always need collateral. They always need website updates, social media, whatever it is. And to maintain your sanity, you've got to have a process for intaking that work.
Right.
And then I think on the other side of prioritization too is always just like making sure that people who are asking you for things have some skin in the game as well. Like
Oh, that's
you
interesting.
know,
Okay. And
yeah,
how do you get them to have that skin in the game?
Yeah, it kind of depends on what people are asking for, but a lot of times, I'll just ask fundamental questions like let's say it's something that doesn't necessarily fit within our established scope of work or budget,
Right.
then I might push back to them and say like, are you willing to if you need to do this, we're willing to help consult and do some project management on it, but we really need you to bring some budget because we don't have the resource, especially like I think small organization, things like that. Just like, are you willing to provide content or bullet points or review, whatever it is. I just think, sometimes when that work falls on the cusp of like being maybe out of scope or whatever, instead of just taking it on and figuring out like, we'll get it done, going back to people and saying, well, I'm happy to help with this, but here's what I need from you. And, not to be too cynical, but a lot of times when you tell people I need something from you, that project goes away. And it
Hmm.
really proves like how important it is. Now, if they come back and say, of course, I'll get you information, or I'll figure out if we can get some budget or whatever. Okay, then I kind of know they're serious about that
Right.
work. But one of my filters right away is like if I ask somebody for two or three things or even one thing and I don't hear from them again, I have a pretty good idea that was not valuable
It was
work to
not
start
that
with.
important, right? Okay, yeah.
Exactly.
And what I would say is that, obviously you're, VP and chief communications officer. And so you have that capacity to have that conversation and kind of push back with someone if they're asking something. But then let's say you're a marketing coordinator or, communication manager or something, and you don't feel you have that authority. You have this, you know, department head is reaching out to you, asking you to do something, and you feel it's not your place to push back.
Yeah.
How does that work to be able to say, well, that's a great question, but I'm not sure I have that budget now, or I don't have the bandwidth to do this. You don't want them to kind of then go bash onto your boss and say, hey, I asked her to do this and she didn't do it, kind of thing. So how would you approach that process of
Yeah. It's a
pushing
great
back, but like gently, I guess?
Oh, it's a great question. And I mean, I think, it all goes back to like stakeholder management relationships, right? So, uh, if you kind of tend to understand how people fill into a category, right? So if I get a request from Brad and I'm like, I know my boss is like, oh, every time Brad asks for something, we've got to do it because he is like one of our key stakeholders. So we're just going to find a way to do it. Okay. At that point, I know like, as long as it's, if it's something I can't do because of budget or time or whatever, even though Brad's a really important stakeholder, what I would do as a contributor is I'd escalate it to my boss. I can just say, hey, Brad really wants to do this. I don't know how to make it happen because I don't have the time or the budget. What can we do? And lean on your boss to manage that stakeholder. Now, if it's some random person you've never heard from ever, and all of a sudden they came out and asked for something, I think you've got some leeway to push
Right, right.
back. And look at that stakeholder map again. Like, who do they report to? What are those ties? Because that can be a way. And I think people should always like cordial and friendly and respectful, but I think you should, again, I'll go back to what I was talking about the process, right? If you have some sort of intake process for new projects, that's what you could use as, a junior level person too. Hey, I've got this form you need to fill out. You know how many times just asking someone to fill out a form has stopped a project?
Tell me
I
about it. Yeah.
probably have dozens of examples of that. Here's our marketing and our communications request form. As soon as I get this back from you, we'll be certain I'll run it up to Brad, ask him what he thinks about it,
Right.
whatever, right? And just those little process things. And again, I also feel like even simple tricks, not tricks, but like sort of strategies of like, if it's something you have to say no to, you can say, I can't do this for you, but here's an idea of how you could get it done. Here's it,
Okay.
or I can't do it for you right now. But if you check back with me in a couple months, we might have the bandwidth to do it. Even strategies like that. But I would always go back to the stakeholder map, figure out the importance of the person making the request, how you've dealt with them in the past, how you've heard your manager talk about that person, and really use that to kind of formulate how you're going to approach it. And again, I think people sometimes are afraid, but like if you have a good relationship with your supervisor, you should be able to ask for help, escalate when you need to, and not be
Mhm.
afraid to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm hearing that, this idea of there's a lot of soft skills that are super essential. And no matter if you're in a larger organization or just an individual hospital, being able to understand those dynamics between the people is a huge asset to being able to do your job better. One thing that I'm curious about is, and it's slightly adjacent, is in a large organization, do you have access to more tools that allow you to manage those processes than in smaller ones, kind of from your experience? Obviously, time is a factor where maybe, 15 years ago, there were less tools available on the market for project management and stuff like that. But do you see small organizations, let's say, rely more on email or internal, messaging, and large organizations use project management tools like Asana or whatever? Like, have you seen a difference in the scale of the organization?
It's a good question. I mean, I think going back to a little bit of what we were talking about before, just the resources in terms of human beings too, like just having people that can
Yeah,
help
yeah,
you your processes and all that. I think you have that. I think you do have more tools. And as far as how much they're used, it's a good question. One thing I noticed about small organizations is that sometimes they'll invest in tools, but don't have anyone to run the tools. And in a large organization, if you're going to make an investment in tools, you generally have subject matter experts that own the tool, that know how to use it, that you can turn to, that help with adoption, things like that. I think the mistake sometimes for a small organization is they invest in tools, but then there's no owner, right? If they don't have an evangelist or an owner who can really be on it full time, it kind of gets used half-heartedly. I was working for an organization once, a smaller group, and I came in and they had like a CRM they purchased but had never used.
Wow.
So it was on contract, but it wasn't being used. That wouldn't happen in a large organization most times. They're going to be an investment. They're going to put someone on it. They're going to have a team member that's responsible for owning it. And things can fall through the cracks of a small organization with tools. And because they sound good and someone will say, make a case for it. But then, hey, if that person leaves the organization or anything, there's no one to pick it up. So
Mm.
I do think that adoption and the evangelism of tools is probably like more consistent in a large organization.
Okay, right. And so that maybe because there's more there's that idea of having someone be an owner to it, but there's also maybe more of a oversight on making sure that these things are used and that the budget is not being wasted or something, maybe
Yeah.
in a more sophisticated
Yeah.
way, I guess, in large organizations. What would, just to kind of complete on the idea of tools, and I've seen that a lot from my perspective, where there's this shiny new object, kind of this new tool, this new SaaS, this whatever that's going to optimize your campaign or this or that. And this, and also, I guess, connects with AI and everything that's, magical these days. And then so kind of people jump onto that, but finally they either just scratch the surface and they pay a huge amount, but they just use a portion of it, or they kind of use it for a couple of weeks. And then, as you mentioned, there's kind of no
Yeah.
adoption. Like, what would be it seems to be by what you're saying, it's a bit small organizations are maybe a bit more of a victim here, but I'm probably not 100% sure because there are like these huge CDPs that large organizations are going to, buy into, but then actually never really use in their day to day. And so, what would you say are things to watch for to make sure that as an organization you're maximizing, the investment that you're doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I do think the big one is just when you're going to invest in a tool, I think being very clear about like, do you have staff that can either own this or put a significant portion of their time to using it? Because that's the biggest challenge. And you talked about it. I mean, I think it could happen to either size organization. Frankly, it's like we invest in a tool, but I'm not willing to give zero point 0.5 of a person to really make it work. Like if that tool needs zero point 0.5 of a person to make it work, like, and we can't do that, then it's probably a waste of money, right? So I think that's sort of like defining what you need to do and making it a priority. I've had lots of conversations over the years with vendors asking, what goes wrong in some of these launches of products? And the biggest one is people sign a contract and then they forget about it for like 3 months. And then, instead of doing a kickoff of their new tool in 30 days, they're doing a kickoff of their new tool in 4 months. And
Right.
they've wasted like 3 months. And then if your, agreement with that vendor is on that 3-year contract or something, it's like, okay, well, we just kind of wasted a couple months of this 36-month contract. And then maybe we don't even using the tool 6 months or 8 months, or maybe even closer to a year. And then like
Hmm.
we use it and then, we use it for a year and it's time to decide if we want to invest in this again. But we wasted a lot of time up front because we weren't really ready to commit a resource. I think that's one of the cardinal mistakes. It's just like, if you're going to do something and it
Right.
has value and you're excited about it, put some, like I said before, put some skin in the game yourself. Like, you've got to do that, or otherwise it doesn't have a very good chance of being successful.
Right. What and I kind of touched on the subject of AI regarding that. And do you think um, smaller organizations or larger organizations are better positioned to leverage AI moving forward? This is an interesting one because I think there's
Yeah.
advantages on both sides, but yeah, like I'd be interested in finding out what your perspective is.
Well, I mean, there could be exceptions, but I do think it largely the larger organizations are just going to be in a better position because they probably have partnerships with, I mean, like at Providence, we have partnership with Microsoft. How many small organizations can do that? Like they can't, right? And so, things like that are just benefit of scale. And also like I think there's just odds that more people in your organization, even if it's a small percentage, are going to be like evangelists for doing something different. And if you're at a small organization, it might be one person or two, but at a large organization, maybe it's a couple hundred, a couple thousand that really are, being innovative and doing stuff with the tools. Like you mentioned AI, our communications team, we've got a small work group. We've got about a 20-person work group who are all focused on like, how are you using AI and what learnings do you have that we can spread to the broader team, right? That's a luxury just not going to get with like a
For
5-person
sure.
team. Like
Yeah. Wow. That is amazing. Yeah.
so doing some of that crowdsourcing and just having access to a big pool of people who might really be interested and might be able to really teach others. Like I just think again, that's something that scale of a large organization, you really have those pockets where there can be a lot of kind of innovation, leadership and stuff going on, you know, that I think is a little bit hard to duplicate a duplicate in a small organization.
Well, that's really interesting because I think on another side, the fact that smaller organizations are more, let's say, scrappy, they can do maybe more trial and error stuff. And if there's a smaller team, the adoption can be really quick. If you got 3 out of 4 people using the AI, like everybody suddenly is using AI, whereas there's probably some kind of adoption and change governance that has to be put into place if you're in a larger organization. So I think there is an advantage also to be a small organization, but it's a difference from a different perspective.
Yep. Yeah, for sure.
What would like, let's say we've talked about all these different aspects of small versus large organization. So what do you think are the kind of overall takeaways? What are the main advantages of being small and the main advantages of being large? And what are the main kind of challenges or things to watch for if you're small and equivalent on the larger
Yeah.
scale? So I don't know, like if you want to go like small, good and bad, or you want to go to like good for both and bad for both? Like, what do you, I'll
Yeah.
let you kind of approach it the way you think.
All right. I'll just try to answer this and see if it makes sense. I think the benefits, and again, a little bit of this is what you can learn from others, but I think the benefits of being small is just a nimbleness, just
Hmm.
being able to do things quickly. I do feel like in a lot of ways, being a jack of all trades and being able to do a number of things, which you do have to do at a small organization, is valuable because, and I think in terms of personal development, unless you really want to specialize in one very specific thing, having access to like understanding for me, like personally, I'll use myself. Like I've done marketing, I've done public relations, I've done communications, I've done like almost every job in those functions. And that's been very helpful to me because if I've wanted to pivot in one direction or another, I can do it.
Right.
I'm not pigeonholed by just knowing how to do one thing. So one of the benefits, I think, if you're out to find yourself, working in a small organization, like lean into those abilities to like learn more about different things and kind of take on different responsibilities because you will be much more valuable to an organization if they can plug you into doing different things. And you'll have a career path that I think opens you up to a lot of different opportunities.
Right.
I think, in terms of what people can learn from each other, both ways too. I mean, I think I talked about it, but small organization can benefit from the structure and process and the ideas of prioritization and intake of projects and stakeholder management, those things that are just like essential at a large organization. You can get away with not having all that at a small organization, but you're going to be a lot more effective and probably like your job if you learn from some of that and do it. So I think that's something that, small can learn from large there.
Yeah.
And another one too that occurred to me as we were talking too, sometimes as a small organization, you're kind of loath to admit that you can't do everything and you need to tap into some expertise or you need to have somebody really focus and prioritize on one thing only. And, those are the times again where you have to really assess, like, should we do this? If we do it, do we need to bring in a partner? Do we need to hire a new position? I think the onus is always on the smaller teams to just figure out, like, we'll just take it on and figure it out. And then they don't end up resourcing it well and it might fail. So I think, large organizations, sometimes you have the team where you can really put somebody on a dedicated piece of work. It's harder to do that at a small organization, but sometimes you have to admit that that's sort of essential. So, I think hopefully in the conversation as people have been hearing us talk, there's insights and inspirations that no matter where you find yourself, you can learn from a small organization if you're a big organization and vice versa, because there are things that are really beneficial kind of going both ways.
Yeah. And at the same time, kind of challenges that each one has can be, there's ways to address it. So let's say a small organization can also say, hey, you know what? I'm going to work with a bunch of different vendors who have that deep
Yeah.
expertise that don't necessarily have in house, right? And so, and since it's easier for them to kind of identify or get stuff signed, then that kind of helps them to get that outside knowledge. But they have to have that. And it's not going to say audacity to reach out and because sometimes teams do want to try to figure it out all themselves and try to save a few dollars there. But I think there is that opportunity to do there. We've talked a lot about how, small organizations can learn from the large ones. What would be like one of those things that large organizations can learn from smaller ones?
Yeah. I think it is just thinking about like, how do you cut back to what is really essential if you need to? So, that sort of scrappiness and nimbleness at a small organization, like, can you infuse any of that into your process? Because I think sometimes with large organization, you have this need to put a bunch of process in place. but then it's over processed, right? So
Right.
like, can we make it quicker? Can we make this? We really need to do it for every time. Do we have a fast track process? What are the ways we can be more nimble? So like looking at if you were more constrained and you didn't have as many resources, could you still do the work? But what would you need to remove from your process to do it? So I think being inspired a little bit to figure out if we're over processed and like, can we make things just
Like, is
move
there any
quicker?
bloat kind of thing?
Exactly. Kind of. This can happen to either size organization too, but it's sort of like we've always done it that way.
Oh, yeah.
And if we've always done it that way, but our process is really laborious and like it's taking so much time, but we haven't looked at it in 5 years. Well, maybe it's maybe it's time to look at it and look at it through the lens of like if we had fewer people or we wanted to move faster, how could we make it work?
And that's really tough to see from the inside. I find that, sometimes you have, this is the way things are done, but it's like, if you go outside and you look at from the outside, like, oh yeah, well, obviously we can cut 5 steps in this process here. But if
Yeah.
you've built your basically your day to day around a specific process, it's really difficult to see the forest for the trees, I think, in that sense. So
Yeah.
that's a tough one. And so this is really, I think it's eye opening. It's very interesting to understand those different dynamics from the larger to smaller organization. If there was like one thing that was actionable, right, that someone in a small organization and someone in a large organization, and maybe the same thing, right, from both perspectives, but which one do you think, if they could do one thing like tomorrow or this week, like what could it be?
That's a really good question. I would say, since going back, you and I met in person at a conference, right? And what I would say is like get out there and network with people who are a little different than you, right? So
Mm,
within your profession, whether it's marketing or public relations or whatever it is, communications, you know, you're probably in a professional organization. Don't just like network with the people who have the same experience as you. Like find different people, ask them how they work, learn from them, connect, network. Build your network with more people who can give you a different experience than what you have. I mean, it's really instructive again to connect with people who are large organizations, but you definitely can learn stuff from people at all organizations. So I would just say, I think that would be my takeaway is like network and learn from each other and don't just be in an echo chamber of people who have the same exact experience you have, same size organization. Like find it can be inspiring. And I think we might traditionally think, well, only the small organizations are going to be inspired by what the big ones are doing. But that's just a really narrow way to think about it. I think you can learn so much from people who are doing stuff on the ground. One piece of advice I have because in the healthcare space is if you're a large organization, sometimes you never see like healthcare being delivered because you're like off
right.
in an office park
So
working
many
remotely.
levels. Yeah.
Well, and you might be working remotely, even if you're working in an office, not connected to the hospital. But that hospital communications marketing person, they might be at the hospital every day. You could ask them about their experience, how that what they've learned about patient care or decision making, things like that. So I just would encourage people learn from someone who has a different experience than you, and I think it really inform the quality of your work in a great way.
Wow, that's great, Alan. So it comes down to people at the end of the day. And I think that's a great conclusion to connect, to learn, and to grow. So thank you so much for sharing your insights about these different sizes of organizations. And if anybody is interested in reaching out to you, I guess they can go to LinkedIn to DM you or something like that.
Yeah, LinkedIn, or I just have my website too, alanshubridge.com to check out my blog. But I love to connect with people and I like to learn from others. So I practice what I preach. So I look forward to hearing from some new people after we get this conversation out.
All right. Thanks, Alan.
You bet. Thank you, Brad.